Hello everyone. I'm glad to be here with you virtually. Although due to COVID-19 we could not meet face to face. But in keeping with the theme of this conference, technology development and landscape management, it goes to show that as a result of issues such as COVID-19, we need to rely on technology to get our work done. And I think that this pandemic actually demonstrates to us the need for technology. And I think the theme of this conference is even more important when one considers what's happening in our world today. I'm going to talk about the role of traditional knowledge in technology development and landscape management, mainly using lessons that we have learned from the Jeff Satayama project. Now, the Jeff Satayama project was run from 2015 to 2019. And it was developed in 10 countries, as you see here. And the objective of this project was to mainstream conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, while at the same time guaranteeing our human well-being, ensuring that we can still improve our lives while at the same time maintaining rich biodiversity in the area which is being occupied. And there were projects in South America, 3 in South America and 4 in the Indian Ocean Islands, and 3 in Asia. But I'm going to focus on the 3 in Asia, particularly because I believe most, if not all, of the participants in this conference are from Asia. So the 3 countries are, firstly, Myanmar. And this project was developed and executed by Fauna and Flora International. And the main ecosystem land use was freshwater lakes. And the objective of this project was primarily to facilitate sustainable use of freshwater ecosystems while conserving the species that exist in these lakes. The second was Thailand, and this was executed by the Intermountain People's Education and Culture in Thailand Association, IMPECT. This is a Karen Indigenous organization. And the ecosystem in question, the forest and land use rotational farming. And the objective of this project was primarily to promote and enhance the Karen Indigenous sustainable production system, which is based on rotational farming. And thirdly, India, a project that was developed in Nagaland by the Energy and Resources Institute of India, and the ecosystem, primarily forest. And so using these 3 projects, I would then endeavor to show how technology development was applied and how management of the resources occurred. Now, indigenous and local knowledge is a very important part of socio-ecological production landscapes and seascapes because it enables people to use and manage these resources in a sustainable way. Now, when one thinks about this, we can focus on the cultural aspects of the indigenous peoples. For example, poems, songs, dances. These oftentimes include elements that are important for sustainability. And so this knowledge that is linked to sustainable use of the landscape is passed down through poetry, song, and dance. Also, we see spiritual aspects. For example, the use of sacred forests, which also has a direct link to sustainability within a particular area. We also see the knowledge that the inhabitants of the area would have obtained over time. And this knowledge could be ecological in nature. They understand animal behavior. They understand spawning behavior. They understand mating seasons. They understand the weather patterns. All of these are very important aspects that need to be taken into consideration when one wants to manage an area in a sustainable way. And then we also see social aspects playing a very important role, such as cuisine. The type of food that is cooked and eaten is oftentimes linked to what grows in that area, what can grow in that area, and the seasons in which these particular products are obtained or are available. And also, preservation techniques plays a very important part as well. For example, if it's an area that has 4 seasons, how do you preserve food, for example, that will last into the winter season? So, first, we need to consider the status of indigenous and traditional knowledge. These, in reality, there are many aspects that affects indigenous peoples in a very direct way when compared to other groups of people within a particular territory. Climate change, for example, is said to affect indigenous peoples in a more direct way as compared to others, primarily because the way in which indigenous peoples live are so close to nature that they feel the effects in a more direct and unequal way as compared to other people within that country. We also see decisions made by national governments and parliaments that oftentimes may affect indigenous peoples in a negative way, especially as it relates to their land. We also see modernization affecting indigenous peoples as well. For example, the construction of dams and roads and other infrastructure oftentimes infringes on indigenous lands or negatively affects the lands in which these infrastructure are developed. Then we see urbanization, which has 2 aspects. One, the rural to urban migration, which obviously affects the indigenous populations where the young people move to the city, but also the expansion of urban areas often encroaches on indigenous lands in order to facilitate the expansion of urban areas. And last but not least, environmental disasters. For example, the pollution of rivers and waterways affects indigenous peoples in a very direct way, because oftentimes the water used is directly taken from these waterways. And so any type of pollution negatively affects indigenous peoples. So now we want to look at the 3 cases in Asia to see what we can learn from these cases as it relates to the use of technology and the impacts on management. So I want to start with Thailand. Now, the Karen people have 2 very important traditional events that are done. The first one I want to talk about is Loeta. And Loeta is essentially the establishment of sacred areas, sacred groves, sacred forests, sacred lands. A ceremony is conducted at the site, and this ceremony brings with it specific rules that governs the way in which this area needs to be managed and taken care of. And if you break any of those rules, what's going to happen is you would have some type of bad luck or misfortune. And so Loeta is essentially a self-governing system, a self-policing system, because even if someone is in the area alone, no one else is watching, they are likely not to violate those rules for fear of mishap or misfortune coming to them and their family. And then the other event is Padepo. Padepo is essentially where whenever a newborn baby arrives, the umbilical cord of that baby is cut and is tied to a tree. That tree is essentially married to the baby, and that tree cannot be cut as a result of that link between that child and that tree. Now, this tradition, which has been occurring for hundreds of years, was essential in protecting and guaranteeing species of trees to survive. And what happened was, with the establishment of hospitals in and around Karen areas, and Karen women going to the hospitals to give birth, the hospitals refusing to give to them the umbilical cord to continue this tradition resulted in the disappearance of many species of trees. Because without the umbilical cord being tied to that tree, persons will cut the tree without any fear of any retribution. I'm happy to say that in recent times, the hospitals have reversed this policy and have started giving Karen women the umbilical cord when requested. And so this tradition is continuing and hopefully will ensure that all the species of trees that are found within the area will continue to be preserved. So we see that modernization or development has to factor in the traditional aspects of a people and its area so that development does not negatively affect conservation practices. Now, the rural to urban migration has been one of the factors that affected the young people and these communities. So, this project facilitated this trend in 2 ways. One, by encouraging dialogue between the elders and the youths. And secondly, by ensuring that the syllabus of the schools within the current areas include indigenous and traditional teachings at those schools. And the local government, the provincial government, has agreed and allowed sessions of current traditional teachings to occur in the schools in current areas. And as these pictures demonstrate, there's been lots of engagements between the elders and the youths. Now, this transfer of knowledge to the youths was then used by the youths and improved with the use of technology. Now, two ways. One, photography. The project ensured that the youths could obtain modern and more professional cameras, and the landscape was photographed, and these photographs were then used on social media. And through this activity, the landscape was then showcased to the rest of the world. The other aspect was the use of GPS to assist in establishing the boundaries of the traditional landscape, and also to assist in identifying the areas where different animal species are found, sighted, and are living. And what did this result into? It resulted in the products being marketed in a way that increases the value of the products. Because the products are now marketed with stories that are demonstrated by the photos that were taken by the youths. And the honey, for example, is used in the Le Tele restaurant in Bangkok, which is a Michelin star restaurant. And it is the honey from this landscape that is used in that restaurant. And this was all facilitated by the youths. The youths brought the chefs into the landscape, introduced them to the landscape, shared the stories, and got the chefs to actually embrace the product. Also, we see the development of gourmet salt and spices, all reaped naturally from the landscape, and the development of a recipe book titled Taj of Lau, which is basically telling the story of the landscape, and at the same time explaining how these recipes or the cuisine of the landscape is done. And as a result of the publishing of this book, many of these cuisines are now available in other parts of Thailand where current people do not live. So we see here essentially how the young people primarily takes the technology that's available to them and coupled with the knowledge of the landscape, merging these two and increasing the income to their communities and contributing to the sustainability of the landscape and the livelihood of the peoples that inhabits these areas. Now, we want to move on to Myanmar. In Myanmar, we see here a bottom-up approach in the establishment of fish conservation zones. These fish conservation zones were established by the local communities who decided, based on the knowledge that they have in relation to the fish stocks that's in the waterways, they are very certain that something needs to be done to ensure the sustainability of the freshwater fish on which they depend. And so fish conservation zones were developed as a way to guarantee this continuity of these species on which they depended. And how did they use technology? Well, we see the establishment of the signs, of the signboards with the rules, etc. But the knowledge that they have in relation to the ecology of the species was essential, because they know exactly how the fish behave. They know exactly how they spawn, where they spawn, when they spawn. And it is this knowledge that they have of the ecology of the freshwater lakes that ensures that they can catch more fish. Of course, this very same knowledge can be applied in a positive way as well, which is to guarantee the sustainability of these very same species on which they depend. And so, using the knowledge that they have and their desire to conserve these areas which they depend on for a livelihood, these fish conservation zones were established. So one essential thing that was done was the use of a float network, as we see in the picture here. Now, these floats were used to demarcate the spawning areas in all of the lakes. And the spawning areas that were demarcated were designated as no-take zones, no-catch zones, so that spawning would occur in these areas uninterrupted. And this guaranteed a particular continuity of the species from that perspective. Also, other things that were applied were the type of fishing gear that could be used. Some of them were banned, such as the use of batteries, which creates a shock on the water, which indiscriminately kills fishes within the area. Use of dynamites, etc. All of these were banned, and only specific nets were used with specific sizes so as to ensure only certain sizes of fish are caught. We also see the local people being involved directly in the monitoring of the catch that occurs within the area. So fishes that are caught for consumption and for market, they are all measured and weighed before they are consumed or marketed. And so there is a constant documentation of fishes that are caught from these areas. Now, what does this do? This provides information that tells the local people whether the work that they're doing to conserve these species is working well or not. So they'll be able to tell, are we catching larger fish or not? Are the numbers increasing Are specific species that were very rare, are they appearing more now? And all of this information then feeds into the analysis of the project to determine how successful these interventions are. Of course, this type of intervention comes with trade-offs, because if they are not catching as much fishes as they used to, then we need to give them some other incentives to ensure that we can compensate for the loss of income, loss of protein, etc., that they incur by establishing these fish conservation zones. And so, what occurred? We have the local parliaments within these provinces recognizing these fish conservation zones, and after officially recognizing them, offering assistance to the communities to develop agriculture, such as crop production, and animal production, such as pigs and poultry. And all of these extension works and capacity building were done by the government to aid the communities in surviving in recognition of their voluntary establishment of fish conservation zones and rules which apply to the community members. Finally, I would like to talk about the India case. Now, in India, there are the chiefs in the Nagaland area, Nagaland communities, and these chiefs are called Gaon Buddhas. Now, the Gaon Buddhas are they're well respected. It's a very long tradition of elders who hold this position until their death. And they are recognized and respected by all community members. Now, what do you do when you have an established tradition like this? Do you dispense of it, or do you utilize it? So, what the project did was to use the establishment of the Gaon Buddhas and apply it to the conservation of community conserved areas. Because what had happened in the past was that many communities had their own community conserved areas. But of course, the territory of each community is quite small. So, if one community decides to ban the hunting of the laughing deer, the barking deer, for example, and another community next door to it does not enact that rule, there's no way we can protect the barking deer, because the area is too small that one community decides to conserve. And so the Tizu Valley Biodiversity Conservation and Livelihood Network was established, which is basically a joining of various community conserved areas together, which are governed by the same rules. And that guarantees that all the animals within that broader area, which encompasses all of these community conserved areas, are protected under the very same rules, where every community member follows the very same rules. And so that ensured essentially a flourishing of the species again. And it's premised on the Gaon Buddhas, which is authentic leadership and which is continue to be recognized by everyone. Now you see here notices that were set up by these committees. Now, Nagaland enjoys special recognition under the Indian Constitution. The rest of India follows the Constitution, but Nagaland, the Constitution gives them the right to establish specific rules of their own to govern the land in which they occupy. And so, the Gaon Buddhas, they can establish, they have their own courts, they establish their own fines for the use of prohibited equipment, etc. And all of this is recognized and respected by local people. And so by using the traditional management system of the Naga tribes, conservation was guaranteed, as opposed to a system which dispenses of the traditional management and more or less establishing something new that works against or competes with the traditional management. So using these three cases, we see that existing traditional knowledge needs to be considered whenever we develop and apply technology. We do not want technology to replace traditional knowledge, but we want technology to factor in traditional knowledge, enhance that knowledge in the management of those areas. We also want to ensure that any management that is applied within the landscape also follows the traditional type of management that exists within the area. Therefore, in closing, it is important that we develop policies that takes into account all of the different sectors that we have, the different levels of government, be it national, regional, local. We also need to integrate the local values that we have, the traditional local knowledge that the people possess. We also need to recognize and respect the customary rights of communities. And we need to also respect the institutions within the community, such as the elders that exist there, and ensure that all of this is used in such a way to properly manage the socio-ecological production landscapes and seascapes. And with that, I thank you for your time. And I know I'm not there to answer any questions, but I am quite happy to take any questions that might be sent via email at a later date. I thank you.